So what I'd like to do now is introduce our next lived experience speaker. Her name is Ashanthi Jayasekera, and I will read, as to not stuff this up for anybody, including myself and looking silly. Ashanthi is a mental health advocate, policy advisor, and lawyer. She's passionate about using her intersectional lived experience of mental ill health, a woman of colour, multiculturalism, and more to advocate for the change in the health system and society. Ashanthi has served as a member of the Brisbane South Primary Health Network Community Advisory Council, where she advised on health reform in the south side of Brisbane. She also has worked across multiple industries as a policy advisor, lawyer, including politics, Indigenous education, and now in the criminal justice sector. As someone who has experienced the challenges of severe mental health issues and the stigma it carries across both personal and professional spheres, Ashanthi's purpose is to challenge that stigma and change the narrative, particularly in multicultural communities. So I want to welcome you here this morning. I've had the pleasure of speaking to you prior to the stream and stuff, and I'm really excited by your perspective on this topic. So I'm going to fade away to the background and let you do your thing.
Hello. Thank you so much, Ben. Really appreciate that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I would like to pay my deepest respects to the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm dialing in here in Meanjin, also known as Brisbane. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have contributed their stories and experience to better the health system. My name is Ashanthi Jayasekera. I'm very grateful to the Finding North Network for giving me the opportunity to share my experience with you today and raise awareness of the challenges facing culturally and linguistically diverse people when addressing the stigma of mental health and accessing treatment. I would also like to acknowledge all the culturally and linguistically diverse people who have come before me to share their stories and their experience to advocate for a better future. In today's presentation, I would like to take you through my experience as a child moving between countries and cultures before delving into my mental health journey. I'll be talking about some of the challenges I experienced when I sought help and how we can challenge stigma and how you can help. I was born in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, the capital city, and I'm from the majority ethnic group in the country, the Sinhalese. I was brought up Roman Catholic and partially Buddhist, but now I identify as atheist. These are all identifiers in my community and how we distinguish ourselves. In Sri Lanka, there are the Sinhalese, Tamils, Moors, Indian Tamils, Burghers, Malays, Chinese, and Badda, our Indigenous people. My country of origin has been colonised 3 times by the Portuguese from 1505 to 1658, the Dutch from 1658 to 1796, and the British from 1796 to 1948. Colonisation in Sri Lanka ended after the Second World War, which we would acknowledge still has significant impacts on our society and global relations today, so I think we should view colonisation in the same way. Before I was born, as you can see, my parents had already migrated to Perth in Australia and were citizens. You can see me here at Hungry Jack's experiencing the joy of a Whopper. My mother travelled back to Sri Lanka just to have me in the same hospital as she had my older sister, and where her mother had delivered all 5 of her children. I was born in Colombo, but we moved back to Perth a few months later, and I grew up in Perth for the first 5 years of my life. I grew up eating Vegemite sandwiches, drinking way too much strawberry Nesquik, making Easter hats, pasta necklaces, going to birthday parties at McDonald's and Hungry Jack's. I loved the ice cream cakes. As a kid, I never questioned that I was Australian. You can see me here in the middle. Sorry, just having a little issue with my slide. I'm in the white top. Here I'm participating in the Sri Lankan New Year festivities at my school. My grandfather became very unwell, so we moved back to Sri Lanka and I started school there. When I got there, I had to sit a test for grade 1, which I failed. Pasta necklaces were not on the test. I joined grade 1 the next year. I learned my times tables up to 12. I was reading and solving math problems. The curriculum there was so much harder than it had been in Australia. I'm second from the left in this one. Kids are incredibly resilient. I adapted. I learned my mother tongue as a second language. I had a Sri Lankan accent. I was in a Catholic international school, which is basically like a private school here, where English was the main language. I remember in grade 2, one of the nuns asked us if we had been to church on the weekend. And if we hadn't been, we were told to stand in the corner. My school still had corporal punishment for the boys, and punishment for the girls was that we would have to stand on rickety wooden desks and try not to lose our balance. Sometimes I fit in, but sometimes I didn't. I was a little too outspoken to be a proper Sinhalese girl. We were supposed to be seen but not heard, respect our elders, even if you thought they were wrong, and you weren't allowed to go anywhere without an escort. When I found these photos for this presentation, what struck me was that everyone looked like me. It's the kind of thing you don't realize means anything to you until you don't have it anymore. These days, I'm frequently the only person of color in the room, and when I'm not, it's something I notice and I appreciate. I lived in Sri Lanka during what is called the Civil War, an escalation of ethnic conflict caused by colonization. I grew up in a place where bombs falling were a part of daily life. We weren't allowed to go to public places. It was too dangerous. Parents would travel separately in case they didn't come home. At least one parent would survive for the kids. You never knew if your classmates were going to be there the next day or if they would be victims in the latest attack. I remember soldiers with assault rifles and checkpoints everywhere. I remember when President Premadasa was assassinated just a few streets over from where I lived. He was killed along with 23 other people by suicide bomber. I remember the front page of the newspaper had a decapitated head on top of a building. I lived in a war zone. At one point, I lived in poverty, right next door to the slums, and I didn't know where my next meal was coming from. That fear of not having food has stayed with me all these years, even when I have so many options, so much food, and of course, Uber Eats as well. I moved to Brisbane in 1998 when I was 10 years old, and I spent the rest of my life here. I quickly adjusted back to being an Aussie kid, accent and all, as you can see. It was a culture shock coming back when kids were allowed to go to the ice cream shop by themselves, allowed to go to movies, all things that hadn't been a part of my life. My parents wanted me to fit in, so they stopped speaking Sinhalese to us, and I lost my language. My parents were pretty strict, and they wanted us to achieve what they hadn't, to be lawyers and doctors. I skipped grade 7 because I had already learnt so much by grade 4 in Sri Lanka, but I was a really anxious kid. I was so worried about disappointing my parents and letting everyone down because they had sacrificed so much for me. I think that's a really common experience for migrant children. Our futures are not our own, they're everyone's. Sorry, I'm just having a little difficulty getting my mouse to the right spot. There we go. By the time I was 14, I had moved through 5 schools, 2 countries, 3 cities. When I was in high school around the age of 14, that's when I started harming myself. I remember people talking about how bubbly and happy I was. In reality, I was constantly masking my distress and unhappiness. I'd lock myself in my room. I would cry in my cupboard. I would cry in the shower. The only places I felt safe to cry. I wore jumpers in summer. My room was a dump and I had no energy to clean anything, barely enough energy to look after myself. My parents provided me with shelter, food, education, and all the physical things I needed, but they didn't know how to emotionally support me. I don't think they'd received emotional support themselves, so they didn't know what it was to support me. I once opened up to the school counsellor, and she told me at the age of 16 that I needed to move out of my house to get away from the toxicity, which completely ignored my reality and my culture. I had no other family in Brisbane, and in my culture, you basically don't move out until you're married. I was so hard on myself at the time. I was too big, not smart enough. My grades weren't good enough. I had zero resilience at the time. Everything distressed me, but I hid it from everyone. That continued through university, but now I'd started drinking to numb myself. I had no language to express what I was feeling, no one to tell. I was in conflict. My perfectionism wanted me to be the most successful, and I just couldn't focus on studying. I also didn't care what happened to me. I was becoming increasingly reckless. In my mind, I wasn't going to make it to 30. I just knew that it wouldn't happen for me. Twice I ended up in ED because I had drunk so much I stopped breathing. To this day, people talk about that story like it's a funny anecdote of how wild I was, how much of a party animal I was. People just thought I was the life of the party, but I didn't care if I made it through. In my 20s, I attempted a couple of times. I felt like a failure for not succeeding, but I like to think there was a part of me that just wanted to give me a chance to survive. I met my now husband, and finally someone saw how much I was struggling. Someone saw behind the mask and convinced me to get help. And that was the start of a very long journey to get where I am today. Just a fun slide now for you to have for the rest of the presentation. Some of the challenges I experienced accessing treatment, some of the inappropriate and culturally uninformed advice I've received over the years included being told to move out of the house when I was 16. When I saw a counsellor in university, I was told to quit law because I had a warped view of the world. And others who just couldn't understand why I wouldn't cut my parents off. My parents had no idea about mental health, depression, anxiety, any of it. They were great about dealing with physical conditions, but mental health was completely out of their depth. I wish I could say that I'm still here because the system worked and I got the help I needed, but really it's mostly luck. My parents were so focused on us succeeding professionally where they hadn't had the opportunity to, that anything that could have gotten in the way of that was swept under the rug. When I started seeking professional help in my early 20s, I went through a number of psychologists who just weren't right for me. One was more like a career counselor, another used CBT, and it just wasn't working for me, but I was too much of a people pleaser to say it wasn't, and I kept going. And then I ghosted her because I was too scared to say anything. I remember one time when I had attempted and the paramedics came, they talked about how the antidepressant I tried to overdose on wasn't actually dangerous. I remember feeling like I'd wasted their time and that next time I should try harder. They took me to the secure mental health ward at the public hospital, and I remember being incredibly scared of that place. I was in there with other people who weren't well, all men who scared me. The waiting room had graffiti all over it, and parts of the seats and walls had been destroyed and torn up. By the time I got to see the very junior psychiatrist, I lied, said it was all a big misunderstanding and I was really fine. Whatever I needed to say to get out of there. He was stressed out and overloaded. He didn't question me, just discharged me. I tried multiple medications that had a lot of side effects, and I had to manage those while I was working full time. I eventually started seeing a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist, and I was diagnosed with a major depressive disorder and severe anxiety. We found the right antidepressant, the right dosage, and the right therapy. I started to be able to manage my distress more consistently, and I wasn't having huge episodes all the time. Stability started to be a part of my life. I began learning more and more about myself. I became my own advocate. I started digging deeper. I didn't want to be triggered by someone raising their voice at me. I didn't want to be hijacked by my emotions. I wanted to find control, but instead I found acceptance and self-compassion. I found a mental health social worker who specialized in trauma, who understood me, who asked questions to understand my culture. She genuinely cared about me. I found a GP who would look after me through multiple specialist referrals, surgeries, investigations, hundreds of blood tests, prescriptions galore. I found medical and allied health professionals who treated me holistically. The public system wasn't able to help me, so I went privately, which I know is a privilege that not everyone can afford. So now I use my privilege and my learnings to try and change the system to make it accessible to everyone. I want the health system to be able to treat multicultural people safely. So how do we challenge stigma? I listened to a presentation by Professor Sir Graham Thornycroft on the evidence for reducing stigma and discrimination in mental health. And the core finding I took away was that social contact between people with a mental health challenge and people without is the most effective intervention. I also know that by sharing my story and normalizing mental health and mental illness, we empower other people to reach out for help and give them the language to ask for that help. I always thought that if anyone knew about my mental health challenges, I would never be hired again. I would never be happy. I would never be successful. Instead, what I found is that I'm not meant for every job. There are certain conditions I need to succeed, and I will not settle for less. I found that success is something I can define. And for me these days, success is about purpose. It's about making a difference for those who don't have the privilege that I do and the opportunity to contribute their voice to the conversation. You can see here on the screen my dogs, Pepper and Pickles. Pepper's the black one, Pickles is the brown one. And my cats, Miso and Pumpkin. I've actively cultivated happiness in my life, and I've learned to value myself just as I am, not for what I do, what I achieve, or what I look like. I have myself, my husband, my fur babies, my friends, my sisters, my help team to thank for that. So what can you do? When people talk about culturally and linguistically diverse people, I wonder if they understand the huge amount of difference that exists within that group. It's literally the rest of the world. We wouldn't say that Australian and New Zealander people are the same, so why would anyone think that Sri Lankan and Indian people are? Respect is a very basic thing, but the amount of healthcare situations I've been in where people have butchered my name and then laughed it off, it's not a joke to me. I can understand that my name might be difficult to pronounce, but just ask me. I'm happy to help you, and I just want the basic respect of being called by my name. Be curious. Ask respectful questions to understand the person's experience. My mental health social worker is an Australian woman who has always been respectful, curious, empathic. When she doesn't know something, she asks. I really appreciate that she seeks to understand my experience and my culture without making assumptions of what might work for me. Part of the intersection of my gender and my culture means that I've been socialized to be a good daughter, a good wife, a good daughter-in-law. I found it really difficult to set boundaries for healthy relationships in my personal and professional life, but with time, patience, and curiosity, I've been successful in doing that. I would recommend reading up on different cultures. The SBS Cultural Atlas is a great resource if you haven't seen it. We're all individuals. My experience is mine, not every Sri Lankan's experience. Every country, every culture is different. For example, on the SBS Cultural Atlas, there are 21 countries listed for Asia. I'm Sinhalese, Sri Lankan, South Asian, Asian. But within that categorization, while there are similarities between Asian cultures, there are a lot of differences too. So don't lump us together. I'm Sri Lankan, but I'm also a woman who lives with disability, and I've lived in Australia for most of my life. So I identify as being an Australian and having Sri Lankan ethnicity. I live in two worlds, which can be difficult, but it's also enriching. Raise awareness. So don't assume that multicultural people understand what the signs are for a mental health condition. Part of it is actually raising awareness of what it looks like, feels like, and where they can get help. You may have heard of the Embrace Project. The Department of Health has worked with Mental Health Australia, the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, the National Ethnic Disability Alliance, and culturally and linguistically diverse consumers and carers to develop a coordinated approach to meeting the unique needs and challenges faced by people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The Embrace Project aims to improve the cultural responsiveness of mainstream mental health services, and they've launched the Framework for Mental Health in Multicultural Australia to help achieve this. The framework helps services and individual workers to evaluate and enhance their cultural responsiveness, including self-assessment against cultural competency standards, along with implementation guidance and supporting resources. It's a free national resource available to any service provider. For me personally, if I can be brave and share my story of when I was most vulnerable, and I can change the trajectory of even one person's mental health journey, then this will have all been worth it. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. You can contact me there if you'd like to discuss anything further. And big thank you to Finding North and to Ben for having me here.
Hi, Ashanthi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for that. Oh, it's just so funny. Like as I was a little bit distracted right at the end there because I just kept thinking of Peter and Pickles and
Pepper and
Misto and
pickles.
Pumpkin. I was just like, they are some really rad names. I love that. um, Love that. I've got some, so there's some questions. I've got some questions, and I wondered if I could maybe just invite us to maybe peel back the layers a little bit. And I'm very conscious this as I sort of in my role in this event, not to make it, what does Ben think about this? And it just be my perspectives. But a curious thing, and I'm sure if I've got the curiosity there, then I won't be alone. I have a very broad range of friends and people I love and respect in my life, and that brought to my attention that in Australia there's 300 plus Indigenous languages still spoken, and there's 300 plus languages from the densely multicultural and ever growing and evolving state of Australia broadly now, and they echo your sentiment in Southeast Asian. A couple, in fact, of good friends of mine from Sri Lanka. I've actually traveled to Sri Lanka, and I've had an experience there that, and really seeing that the different kinds of experiences people have within that place, and it made me sort of understand more about the culture, how that's informed through the history, which I know has been far from always in just complete peace. I understand that it's been really, really challenging. I wondered, in your experience, and I wanted to first validate the heck out of you for your experience, because I'm just so grateful and fortunate for you to share that. Being someone who identifies as an Aussie, right, with a heritage from these different places, what would you sort of say to those who find that they are still receiving heavily stigmatized attitude from non-Indigenous Australians, who almost feel like they might almost feel that there's not even this effort made to things like as simple, I think, as pronunciation, which is why when we spoke earlier, I was like, Jayasekera, not Jay, and Ashanti.
Yes.
And it's just basic stuff, right? Like,
yeah. But it's so appreciated when someone does it, like, because it's not often that it happens. And so you really do notice it. Yeah.
So in your experience, what would you say to people who might be in the receiving end of that, people that have their nationality, their heritage comes from different places, but they're still sort of feeling that stigma in their communities, workplaces, whatever it might be? What would you say to them?
In terms of that, yes, I really think that, that racial discrimination and that sense of not feeling like you belong definitely compounds everything else, really. So it's a compounding layer of disadvantage, I think. And within that, it's quite complex, right, in terms of whether as if you're culturally and linguistically diverse within that group, there's also culturally and racially marginalized. So not everyone within the culturally and linguistically diverse community will fit within the culturally and racially marginalized communities, because there is such a diversity of experience within that. And if you want to know more about that, please have a look at the Diversity Council Australia. They have some fantastic resources. I think for anyone who's experiencing that, and I certainly have, I would say that one of the best things that I've done is actually finding community and finding other people in my workplace or within my industry who are going through the same thing as me, because it's incredibly validating to have somebody say, hey, you're not crazy. This is happening, and you are experiencing something that maybe somebody else might see. Because especially things like microaggressions are really hard to pinpoint. It's really hard to actually, to actually vocalize it and to have the language to say that this is something that I'm experiencing and it's making my life a lot harder. I don't think it's well understood in Australia. And I particularly, I think that there are some similarities between culturally and linguistically diverse communities and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, not our, but the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. And some of my very good friends are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. And I think one of the wonderful things we have in our communities is that we have community, we have connectedness, we have relationships, we build trust, we have a lot of strengths that we come from. And so that's part of what I'm conscious of when I talk about culturally and linguistically diverse people and our First Nations people, is that we need to take a strengths-based approach. We need to, focus on the strengths that we bring. And then the same thing with people with lived experience. We have so much strength. We have so much richness in our experience that we can contribute to change the conversation and to make it better. So I hope that answers it. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful answer.
Thank you.
I'm sure the audience agrees. I've got a Natasha Singh. She said, just a comment, as a fellow Sri Lankan, there's some aspects of your journey that I can fully relate to. And I see that other fellow Sri Lankans experience where they don't talk about their mental health, and it's often swept out under the rug. She said there's, and with that, some of the experiences is something that her, sorry, let me read this correctly, is something my sister had experienced with a therapist who didn't have the cultural awareness either. What comes to my mind is the connection with your therapist. You spoke about the holistic approaches, the pharmacological interventions, which are incredibly powerful tools to help create capacity and agency and mitigate symptoms, severity, and all of this. That connection and that experience that Natasha's sharing, I just wondered if you wanted to, we've got about a minute to go, to speak to that comment, just about, sort of there's no real question there, but perhaps you might want to just add to that. I'm not sure.
Natasha, I 100% everything you just said about your sister's experience, I just, really, really touched me because it is so hard when you're in such a vulnerable state and you are reaching out for help and you have gathered your courage to go and get that help, and then somebody on the other side of that has told you something that is completely inconsistent with your culture and your reality, and you think, what's the point? Why am I doing this? And in fact, that first experience I had with the counselor at university set me back for years in terms of reaching out again, because I was too scared to. I thought, what is the point? And that, I think, is the point as well of sharing these stories and to talk about our stories and to explain the experience that we have, because I don't think it's well understood. And there are so many people, I think, who are culturally and linguistically diverse who are affected by that stigma, and it's so hard for them to get help. And if they do get help, if that's their experience, it's not good enough, essentially. So I would like us to change that if we can. And I think we can. So, thank you for sharing your experience as well, and your sister's experience. I think that's really powerful.
Thank you, Natasha. I really appreciate that. And Ashanthi, thank you so much. Lovely to see you again. I've connected with you on LinkedIn. I can't wait to just continue to watch your work and seeing what you do out there, spreading that message far and wide. You're so right that every instance of authentic self-expression is medicine. It's the literal blueprint for others in a similar experience, or even if it's not the same, it's in different ballparks. It's like I'm inspired by your experience, although mine is very different. And I'm sure everyone in attendance is feeling the same. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Lovely to have you.
Really lovely to be here.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Explore more Perspectives 2024 on Finding North Network's YouTube channel. Find out more by visiting findingnorthnetwork.com.au or email info@findingnorthnetwork.com.au.